Welcome to the program. My guest is Michael Signer. Mike is the author of Becoming Madison and Demagogue, the fight to save democracy from its worst enemies. Mike is the mayor of the city of Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you for being here, sir.
Always a pleasure.
I appreciate you coming in on short notice. I wanted to talk to you about something that happened recently.
Yeah.
You're standing on the downtown mall in the heart of historic Charlottesville, surrounded by hundreds of people who are cheering what you are saying.
Yeah.
Mike, what did you have to say to those people, and why have you been making headlines recently?
It was an event and a community gathering yesterday to declare that Charlottesville was a capital of the resistance against, I described it yesterday as these kind of forces of both intolerance and incompetence that we're seeing around us when it comes to what government is doing as it affects everyday people's lives. The event started very fast, and it gathered an unbelievable amount of momentum just Saturday. I mean, right now it's only Wednesday, so Saturday, Charlottesville is home to a major office of the International Rescue Committee, where my wife also has volunteered, which brings political refugees to this country after extreme vetting. Let's be clear, these folks go through over a year and a half, 2 years of extreme vetting of their backgrounds. I met on Saturday at the mosque in town here, the Islamic Society of Central Virginia, about 36 political refugees who live in this community and who I'm responsible to. There was a political dissident from Iran who had started a kind of an activist group there whose brother was killed for the activism there. There was a guy from Syria who's a professional wrestler, his son was too. The government forces tried to force him and his son to serve in the forces. His son was killed in front of him. There was a mom from Syria waiting for her daughter who had a flight to come here. There was an Iraqi translator for US troops. All these people were in a state of almost blind panic about what this mishandled executive order meant for them and their families.
And these are people right here in Charlottesville.
And yes, and worse, in the town and the area which gave the world our ideas of religious liberty. As I go through in this speech yesterday, this is where James Madison came up with the statement, defended the rights of Baptists who were imprisoned in Culpeper as a young kind of college graduate activist. And this is where Thomas Jefferson wrote the Statute for Religious Freedom. And this is where Madison wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments. So that all happened here. So you've got the IRC office, you've got religious freedom, these are American values. And I just thought it was time to take a stand. And I'd been speaking all last year about Donald Trump as a demagogue in relation to this book. But this is much bigger. I said yesterday, this is not about a person or a party or a president. This is about values, American values, patriotism. And I just thought it was time to resist specifically for these folks. And there were a bunch of specific policy things that I talked about that we've already started to set in motion, getting lawyers, a team of lawyers
and that's place. Important, right? Because this is not just, because somebody asked me the other day, is this just some grand statement or grandstanding? And I said, no, as I understand it, it includes a whole bunch of policy proposals that the city intends to act on.
Yep. Already have a team of lawyers in place. There are dozens of folks who need attorneys to advise them of their rights and to represent them and advocate for them. And that's an expensive proposition. There's not a lot of immigration specialists. There are more that are kind of coming to me and coming to this team we put together, so that's one thing. I talked this weekend to Senators Mark Warner and Tim Kaine, who leaped at the chance to have caseworkers in their office dedicated and helping these folks. That's not something that the group that I met with on Saturday, that's not familiar to them. It's sort of intimidating to call the office of a senator, U.S. senator, and say, hey, I need help with my issue, before these federal agencies. But so we've getting that.
The community can connect these dots for them.
Exactly, and a mayor can connect these dots.
Right.
We have a Human Rights Commission that I believe should be working on issues of anti-immigrant bias. There are a lot of complaints that I'm hearing, and that commission was set up several years ago. And I also think, something that's drawn a little bit of controversy is I want to be advised by our staff on the full range of legal options we have if these efforts by the federal government become more draconian. There's this idea of a sanctuary city that is kind of out there, as I understand it, in Virginia, and this is a term of art. You really figure out your own way to relate to the federal government on immigration issues, and there's many questions that a city, depending on its size, depending on the buildings that it has, churches, emergency rooms, it figures out how to relate to the federal government when they start ratcheting up and doing increasingly draconian things. And these questions may be presented to us. So we need to have a discussion in this city about how are we going to, what are our legal options for protecting immigrants and refugees. And so I think we should start having that discussion. Not sure where it's going to end up, but I think it's an important policy item for us.
Yeah. So what are you hearing from people since that address before the community on the downtown mall?
Dozens of people have been coming up to me when I walk on the mall, sending emails. We've gotten very rare to get that many phone calls about issues like this, but there's been, there's been a lot of phone calls and voice messages left, and basically people have been saying, thank you, and you gave me hope, or this gave me hope.
Right.
And the experience that I had at this event, it was so representative of what makes this city so, you're the great chronicler of Charlottesville. It's this kind of exceptional, unique place, and you saw there, Khizr Khan came and spoke, you had the rabbi, Rabbi Tom Guthers, were the oldest continuously operating synagogue in Virginia. You had the oldest African-American church here, Hodari Hamilton, the pastor there. You had the head of the IRC. You had an Iraqi-Pakistani political refugee who was here. You had a Latin American
and what does all that
immigrant
say to you
who had served as a
Marine?
He had served as a Marine, and he's getting his citizenship. It
What
said to
does
me
that say
that
about diversity, community?
This is the right place for an eruption of resistance against these threats to our values, because we have it going on in all the right ways. I talked yesterday. I understand there's a lot of changes coming to this country. I understand that they're frightening to a lot of people. My grandparents are passed away, but I know that probably the economic, demographic, cultural changes, technological will be frightening. I understand that there's a temptation with these tsunamis of change. They're sweeping to double down kind of on the past and to look at people through these old stereotypes and I think we see that in a lot of this politics that has taken over this last year. But I just think it's the wrong path, because that stuff is in the rearview mirror already. And in Charlottesville, there's a second path, which is you embrace diversity, you embrace innovation, you embrace difference, you embrace the resiliency and the change. There's a lot of change that comes with an economy like that. But this city, we have the number one public university in the country, and we have an unemployment rate of 3.9%. It's the lowest unemployment rate in Virginia. We just launched a biotech organization with over 40 biotech companies. Those sorts of companies want to be in Charlottesville, because that's the values of this new frontier of corporate America. This is where this is going, so you can fight it, or you can kind of get on board and try to figure out how to match up American values with where the economy and society are going. And diversity and difference and pluralism are the source of strength for us as an economy, as a country, and a state, and a city.
Mike, you're a terrific student of history, and you mentioned, you can understand when people say things are changing so much, you can understand the appeal that they might have for somebody like Donald Trump. I'm going to take you back to an era when you didn't have to worry about all of this kind of stuff. And history isn't shy at all about giving us examples. In a sense, we've been here before, have we not? Where people were desperately trying to double down on what things were like 20 years ago. We saw this in the 1790s in America with the great changes.
Yeah, we saw in the 1930s. That was the last great period where you had, in the years after the Great Depression, kept on lingering on and on and on. And a lot of people were very frightened of economic stagnation. They were frightened of the waves of nationalism that were happening abroad in Europe. This was the last great era of demagogues in this country when you had Huey Long and Father Coughlin and
the America First Committee
That's
with
right.
Lindbergh and people saying we're going to just shut out the rest of the world and do our own thing. And in a sense, we've come full circle. Here we are with an American firster in the White House. So
in my, it's funny how you start practicing what you preach. So in my book, Demagogue, this was a book that came out in 2009. As I said yesterday, it was out of print until Donald Trump kindly brought it back. People buying, print on demand copies.
Right.
But the argument, which I came to after many years of really careful study, this was my doctoral dissertation, is that American democracy, our history it is chapter after chapter of tests and responses of the democracy itself. So the big SAT word is constitutionalism. That's the culture that we have. It's the culture. It's not institutions. It's not the courts. It's the people who
it's
support
a way of
the
thinking
courts. It's a way of
about your
thinking.
relationship as an individual to others in your community and to those institutions.
It's a way of thinking and acting and what you do with your life. What do you do? What are the values and beliefs that come into your actions? That is, and it can be at a very high level, like the U.S. Senate. It can be like when Joseph McCarthy was confronted by Joseph Welch and by the Army McCarthy hearings. That was constitutionalism in action. That was a confrontation with a threat to democracy. It can happen at very small levels, like these protests. I mean, I don't mean small. I mean, by normal people in their everyday lives, like with these massive protests last Saturday, the Women's March. That was constitutionalism. So there are tests and threats to a democracy. They come up because of many reasons, but right now we're being tested. And I saw yesterday in Charlottesville, home of Thomas Jefferson, as really, hundreds and hundreds of people coming together and saying, we do stand up. The Latin word for resist is to stand, the root. And these folks yesterday and all these speakers there's lots of specific ideas for what you do with government programs and so on, and what these people will do when they support the ACLU making lawsuits and so on, actions like that. But then there's people in their day-to-day lives. How do they behave? How do they deal with each other? How do they resist threats? And I thought that the event was really an action in those ways. So it was remarkable.
Yeah. So what has crossed your mind, Mike, over the last couple of weeks since Donald Trump has assumed the presidency, and it seems like one big headline after another that is delighting one half of the country and saying, yep, he's keeping to his word, he's opposing the establishment, he's making these big changes, he's shutting out the Muslims, and the other half of the country seems to be pulling their hair out.
Yeah.
And saying, oh my gosh, the very foundational beliefs and principles that America has always stood for and likes to believe that it stands for, they are at great risk. And they are being laid waste to by a populist movement. It's not even conservative, it's a populist movement. What's crossed your mind?
What's crossed my mind is the last poll I saw, he was at 35% approval rating. And that means that he is losing the favor of the people. And I think that that's happening because of what I'm talking about and because of the choices that they're making up there. I really find it incomprehensible. When you're in, I said yesterday, when you're in, intolerance in government tends to lead to incompetence in government because it's based on treating people with stereotypes and thinking only in terms of categories and not implementation. And that's what we're seeing. So we're seeing very rash decision-making that is aimed, there was a very brilliant article by Benjamin Wittes, who is not a shrinking violet on terrorism, real terrorism authority, where he described the executive order last week as malevolent because it really had a punitive purpose and effect on this group of people. It was not carefully tailored to accomplish any security means. It was like putting down a sledgehammer.
A demonstration of force.
Yeah, and so what's crossed my mind is I believe that the country is not getting in line with this whole approach, and I think that that's going to matter a lot. I wish that now that Donald Trump is president, that he would govern the country and seek to be a consensus president and seek to pursue policies and a approach of governance that really did unite the country and I want that office to work, that is the chief executive of the United States, but if that office threatens American values and is eroding our institutions, which I think is the danger, then you do need to resist. That's how the country is built. You have resistance within the other branches and within the citizenry. So, we have a lot more time to go in this administration, but my goodness, I just am amazed at how bad it's been so far.
So what's your response, Mike, to those who support Trump, who would say, you crazy liberals, you're just overreacting? And now you know how we felt in 2008 when we were out in the streets protesting President Obama, when we felt like all the things that we believed in as being American values were being laid waste to by 8 years of Obama.
Yeah.
And for them, there's a real apples to apples there. Now you know how we feel.
I believe strongly in the core rights of everybody to complain hugely in this country. That's a great part. Yeah. Great part. You get it at the local government level. You get it at every level. We have seen, if you just kind of step back, institutions are not very popular in this time in the world. You've seen
it's not an American thing.
No, you've seen a decreasing unpopularity to political institutions everywhere. So, I thought that President Obama had a very healthy attitude about all this. He was very good-humored and very circumspect about just the unbelievable level of attacks he took. So I think anybody in public life has to sort of grow an extremely thick skin nowadays. So, and there's a real level of cynicism around people, I think government itself across the West. With that said, I don't think it's apples to apples. I think that the
2017 to 2008, yeah.
We have never seen this level of open disregard for just basic constitutional principles and checks and balances from somebody in this position of power, like the freedom of the press or the separation between church and state or not having political violence at rallies, for instance, not to mention, very strong relationships with a foreign power that actively was involving itself in our election. Those are all facts, and
the full story of which is really yet to be learned.
Yeah, they're not alternative facts, they're facts. So because all those things happened during the campaign, I believe that he has a greater burden, but an opportunity also to act and govern in a unifying way, which to me would begin with competence. And it would begin with not throwing bombs and pulling pins out from grenades and doing it, whether on Twitter or with policy or whatever. It would mean that you take a measured tone, that you're humble, that you have a great office, that you would have a great country, and you try to govern through the presidency as well and as best as you can. And that's how basically every other, I didn't agree with George W. Bush on a lot of stuff, but I thought that he generally conducted the office pretty, with kind of an eye to that, how it fit into the rest of our values. Coy, what really tipped me over the balance, I just spoke to a class today at the politics department at UVA, and I was talking about, it was a very busy last couple weeks for me as mayor. I had the State of the City speech, and there's a lot, we're in budget season, so there's a lot going on. So I wasn't really focused on opposing or dealing with this administration very much for the first 7 days, because I was focusing on Charlottesville. So I wasn't tweeting about it, I was just I'd done a lot last year during the campaign because I felt very strongly about the demagogue part. But when I did this meeting with my people, they live in our city, my city, I'm their mayor, their fury and fear and anxiety at basically being made to feel like enemies of the state, they fled tyrannies and autocracies in their home countries. They fled them for freedom. They came through the political refugee committee. They are living in Charlottesville. They're not the people we don't want here. They're exactly the people we want here. And they are terrified of this country now. And that's the reality. So the reality of this mix of Intolerance and incompetence is that it creates that experience in people that I think we want here, and we want the country to remain what the Statue of Liberty says. Your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And that is not what is happening right now. So that's why I think it's so important to redress, resist, confront these policies and this politics.
Yeah. Mike, you are a true student of the practice of constitutional democracy. So for those folks watching us now, what's your advice from your perspective? How do you resist? What do people actually do with their day, with their time? The people who, as you say, and we both know a bunch of them, who are truly frightened and concerned. They're not worried about America surviving. They're worried about everything America stands for surviving.
Yeah. Look, I have an extremely broad way of thinking about this, and I think we all need to. A couple people yesterday said, well, I just feel like it's so daunting, it's so intimidating, how do I resist? And I said, look, calm down. You can resist by making a contribution to the ACLU. You resisted by going to the Women's March. I have a friend who has a friend who voted for Donald Trump, who lives in this community. She told that friend about the experience of these refugees on Saturday. That friend came yesterday to the rally, now is putting on Facebook about how her mind has been changed. That's resistance. That's just a conversation. You can, these lawsuits that are happening is resistance. Lawyers helping these folks is resistance. A Senate aide or a young staffer somewhere deciding to spend their time reading, a book that informs them about other periods of time so that in their next that's resistance.
Calling your elected officials.
Making a phone call to elected officials is
Which,
resistance.
by the way, we should just say, you call. They give much more weight to a phone call than they do to an email.
Everybody is busy in this time we live in. There's this thing about busyness that we all experience it. You've got a limited amount of time in the day and in the week. If you spend some of that time acting and interacting in a way that is standing up for values, whatever that means, I see that as resistance, because consider the alternative. It's a country where everybody's asleep, inactive, turned off, disengaged, and this machine just rolls on. And that's not the America that we always have had in the past. And I don't think that's the America that's happening right now. So that's my vision of resistance. I think it means a ton of different things.
I think one of the takeaways from this conversation is that we truly have been here before, and that this is how democracies function. They test the citizenry. Power will test the citizenry to see perhaps how far it can go, what it can get away with, what it can do and not do. And the power of resistance among citizenry has always been a countervailing force. And in fact, if you go back to the writings of the founders, it's set up just to do that. That is the vision of a constitutional democracy, to empower the citizens with free speech so that they can take to the streets or however they find and share truths with one another and resist the assaults on the values that they have.
That is 1,000% correct. The great preoccupation of the Founding Fathers was demagogues and tyranny. It was in the bloodstream in the 18th century, in this country, in countries they were watching, in the histories they were reading. The word demagogue appears in the first and last of the Founding Fathers, of the Federalist Papers. They were constantly thinking about, there are men who are very ambitious and very brutal and very seductive, and there are foreign threats to the country. There are institutions that could become weak against forces of corruption. There are lots of threats to any democracy. They were, they had a chance to create this thing more or less from scratch, so they were very focused on building it right and not having it fall apart after a few years.
And one of the keys to that, Mike, was the separation of powers. That is written in everything they did.
Yes.
It's there in everything.
Yep.
The idea that do not let power coalesce into one institution, into one office, even into one level of government. We had federalism for a reason.
Yep.
The states' governments were to resist the federal government.
Yep. There are separation of powers, but in a way that each power is also linked to each other. So they have something they need from each other, but they have to compete, and they also have areas that they only control, and that's crucial. Yeah. The other piece in all this is, you can liken it to there's the body and there's the soul in theology that gives life to the body. There's the ghost in the machine. There's skeleton. There's muscle, and those checks and balances. The hard parts. They don't work unless you have this culture around it, and that's a way that people just decide to act and believe and conduct themselves, how they speak, what their culture is around issues like tyranny, responsibility, citizenship, accountability. And that was the real message from the Founding Fathers. That is everywhere in our founding documents. It's in the way the federal judiciary was set up. It's the way the Senate was set up. It's how they envisioned citizenship itself to be. So they wanted lots and lots of people, regular people, elevated people, to take this thing very seriously. We're really supposed to take a sense of personal responsibility over the course of the democracy. And that is an institution. That is part of this. And that is what gets tested.
The voice of the citizenry.
The strongest, the strongest force against tyranny, corruption, all these other things was just the people's culture, how they decided to react against threats. But that did, you're 100% right, because that did acknowledge and even embrace that there were going to be many, many, many threats that were going to come up in a system based on freedom.
Mike, thank you for the work you do, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Coy. I always
Mike
appreciate it.
Signer. Mike is the mayor of the city of Charlottesville, and you can read his books, Demagogue, The Fight to Save Democracy from Its Worst Enemies, and of course, Becoming Madison. The complete archive of this program is online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and you all be good to each other.